November 12, 1944. Philippine Sea, approximately 80 miles east of Luzon. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood on the flag bridge of the heavy cruiser Nachi, binoculars pressed against his face, watching something that contradicted every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy had made about American industrial capacity. Through the early morning haze, he could make out the distinctive silhouette of an American Essex-class carrier, her deck alive with movement. What happened next would fundamentally alter Japanese naval strategy for the remainder of the war. In the span of just under 90 minutes, Onishi witnessed a single American carrier launch wave after wave of aircraft, a continuous stream of Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers that seemed to have no end. The air officer aboard Nachi counted them aloud as they lifted off. 20 aircraft, then 40, then 60. The count continued past 80, past 90, reaching 103 aircraft from a single carrier before the launch cycle concluded. Onishi lowered his binoculars slowly. His staff officers waited for orders, but the Admiral said nothing for several long moments. He had commanded carriers earlier in the war. He knew what a full-deck launch required: the precision, the timing, the trained deck crews working in orchestrated chaos. What he had just witnessed should not have been possible from a single ship. The mathematics were impossible to ignore. One American carrier had just put more aircraft into the sky than 3 Japanese carriers could manage combined, even if Japan still had 3 operational carriers with full air groups, which by November 1944, it did not. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the shock that Onishi experienced that morning, we must return to the origins of Japanese carrier aviation and the doctrinal assumptions that shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy's approach to naval air power. In the decade before Pearl Harbor, Japan had built what many observers considered the world's finest carrier force. The Akagi and Kaga, converted from battlecruiser and battleship hulls respectively, gave Japan experience in carrier operations throughout the 1930s. The Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built fleet carriers commissioned in 1937 and 39, refined Japanese carrier design. Japanese naval aviators were among the most skilled in the world. Pilots often accumulated over 800 hours of flight time before being assigned to carrier squadrons, far more than their American counterparts in 1941. The emphasis on quality over quantity defined Japanese naval aviation philosophy. Japan would field fewer carriers than potential enemies, but those carriers would operate with such skill and precision that numerical disadvantage would become irrelevant. This philosophy worked spectacularly at Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, launched the attack that brought the United States into the war. The operation demonstrated flawless coordination. 353 aircraft struck in 2 waves, achieving near-complete surprise. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged. Multiple airfields were devastated. American casualties exceeded 2,400 killed. Japanese losses were minimal: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines. For Japanese naval planners, Pearl Harbor validated their entire approach to carrier warfare. Quality, training, and superior tactics could overcome quantitative disadvantages. The carriers that struck Pearl Harbor represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval construction. Shokaku and Zuikaku, commissioned in 1941, displaced 29,000 tons fully loaded and carried 72 aircraft. Their hangars were fully enclosed, protecting aircraft from weather but creating ventilation challenges. Their aviation fuel systems used individual tanks rather than a central system, theoretically improving survivability. Japanese carriers emphasized offense over defense. Anti-aircraft armament was light. Damage control systems were adequate but not exceptional. Armor protection was minimal. The design philosophy assumed that Japanese carriers would strike first, strike hard, and destroy enemy carriers before being attacked themselves. This assumption began unraveling at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. For the first time in naval history, two carrier forces fought without ever coming within visual range of each other. Aircraft attacked ships, ships attacked aircraft, but the surface vessels never exchanged gunfire. Shokaku was severely damaged by American bombs. Zuikaku's air group suffered heavy losses. The small carrier Shoho was sunk. The Americans lost the carrier. Lexington and Yorktown was damaged, but American pilots proved far more effective than Japanese planners had anticipated. 1 month later, at Midway, the Japanese carrier force suffered catastrophic defeat. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk in a single day. Over 300 aircraft were destroyed. More critically, hundreds of experienced pilots, maintainers, and deck crew were killed. These losses could not be replaced. Japan's emphasis on extensive training meant that producing new carrier aviators took years, not months. The pool of qualified instructors shrank with every battle. As the war continued, Japanese pilot quality declined steadily, while American pilot quality improved. The industrial disparity became apparent immediately after Midway. The United States had already begun a massive carrier construction program. The Essex-class carrier program, authorized in 1940, represented a revolutionary approach to naval aviation. Rather than building a small number of individually optimized carriers, the United States would build large numbers of standardized carriers using assembly line techniques pioneered in commercial shipbuilding. The design specifications were established after careful analysis of early war lessons. The Essex class would displace 27,500 tons standard, 36,000 tons fully loaded. Length would be 872 feet, beam 147 feet. The flight deck measured 862 feet by 108 feet, significantly larger than Japanese carrier decks. This additional space was critical. Larger decks meant faster launch and recovery cycles. 4 steam catapults could accelerate aircraft to flying speed in less than 3 seconds. 3 aircraft elevators, each capable of lifting 2 aircraft simultaneously, moved planes between the hangar deck and flight deck in approximately 15 seconds. The machinery spaces generated 150,000 shaft horsepower, pushing the carrier to 33 knots maximum speed. This speed was crucial. Fast carriers could position themselves for strikes, evade submarine attacks, and operate with battleship task forces. But the most revolutionary aspect was the air group. An Essex-class carrier's standard air group consisted of 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers, a total of 90 aircraft. In practice, carriers often operated more than 100 aircraft by packing the hangar deck and parking aircraft on the flight deck. This was possible because of the sheer size of American carriers and the efficiency of their deck operations. Compare this to Japanese fleet carriers. Shokaku and Zuikaku carried 72 aircraft. The larger Taiho, commissioned in March 1944, carried 75 aircraft despite being significantly larger than Essex-class carriers. The differences extended below deck. Essex-class carriers incorporated extensive damage control systems based on hard lessons learned from earlier battles. The aviation fuel system used a sophisticated purging arrangement that could replace gasoline fumes in fuel lines with inert carbon dioxide within seconds, dramatically reducing explosion risk. Firefighting systems included foam generators, sprinkler systems, and portable pumps distributed throughout the ship. Watertight integrity was exceptional. The hull was divided into hundreds of separate compartments. Damage to one area could be isolated, preventing progressive flooding. Armor protection was extensive. The flight deck had 2.5 inches of armor over vital spaces. The hangar deck had 3 inches. Side armor ranged from 2.5 to 4 inches. This armor could not stop armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes, but it defeated near misses and smaller weapons. Anti-aircraft armament was formidable and constantly upgraded. Initial Essex-class carriers mounted 12 5-inch 38-caliber dual-purpose guns in twin mounts, 32 40mm Bofors in quad mounts, and 46 20mm Oerlikon cannon. By 1944, this had increased to over 75 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers. The construction pace was extraordinary. USS Essex, the lead ship, was laid down April 28, 1941, at Newport News Shipbuilding. She was launched July 31, 1942, just 15 months later. She was commissioned December 31, 1942. From keel laying to combat readiness took less than 21 months. Newport News, Bethlehem Steel, Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Philadelphia Naval Shipyard all built Essex-class carriers simultaneously. At peak production, a new Essex-class carrier was commissioned approximately every 7 weeks. The numbers reveal the scale of American industrial mobilization. By the end of 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned. By the end of 1944, 13 were operational. By war's end, 17 Essex-class carriers had entered service. Another 7 were under construction when Japan surrendered. This production miracle was possible because American shipyards had effectively industrialized carrier construction. Standardized designs meant that components could be prefabricated in factories across the country, then shipped to shipyards for final assembly. A worker in Pittsburgh might manufacture the steel framework for a gun mount. Another worker in Chicago might build the electrical control panel. Another in Los Angeles might produce the radar system. All these components would arrive at Newport News or Brooklyn, where they would be installed in sequence according to carefully planned schedules. The workforce was equally revolutionary. By 1943, over 40% of American shipyard workers were women. They worked as welders, electricians, pipe fitters, and riveters, jobs traditionally reserved for men. Many shipyards operated 24 hours a day in 3 8-hour shifts. Workers' housing, childcare facilities, and cafeterias were built near shipyards to maximize efficiency. The social transformation was as significant as the industrial achievement. For Japan, attempting to match this production was impossible. Japanese shipbuilding remained largely traditional. Skilled craftsmen built ships in small numbers using time-intensive methods. The largest Japanese shipyards were located in Kure, Yokosuka, Nagasaki, and Sasebo. These facilities had built warships for decades, but they could not scale to American production levels. Raw materials were increasingly scarce. By 1943, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, strangling imports of steel, oil, and other critical materials. Labor shortages were severe. Japan had mobilized its male workforce for military service. Unlike the United States, Japan did not systematically employ women in heavy industry. The cultural barriers to women working in shipyards remained strong throughout the war. Even when Japan attempted to build new carriers, the results were disappointing. The Unryu class, designed as smaller, cheaper alternatives to Shokaku-class carriers, should have provided Japan with replacements for Midway losses. 17 were planned. Only 3 were completed before war's end. Unryu was commissioned August 6, 1944. She never saw combat. On December 19, 1944, while transiting the East China Sea, the American submarine Redfish torpedoed and sank Unryu with the loss of over 1,200 crew members. She had been operational for 4 months. Her sister ship Amagi was commissioned August 10, 1944. She spent her entire career in Japanese home waters, rarely venturing to sea due to fuel shortages and lack of trained pilots. American aircraft caught her in harbour at Kure on July 24, 1945, and sank her at anchor. Katsuragi, the third Unryu-class carrier completed, was commissioned October 15, 1944. She conducted training missions but never engaged in combat operations. She survived the war and was used to repatriate Japanese soldiers from overseas after surrender. The contrast between Japanese and American carrier programs was psychologically devastating for Japanese naval officers who understood the implications. Every intelligence report confirmed that American carrier numbers were increasing while Japanese numbers declined. By mid-1944, Japan had effectively lost its carrier force. Shokaku was sunk June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, torpedoed by the submarine Kavala. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, was sunk October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf by aircraft from multiple American carriers. The large carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most sophisticated carrier, lasted only 3 months. Commissioned March 7, 1944, she was sunk June 19, 1944, by torpedoes from the submarine Albacore. The loss of trained personnel was equally catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, known to Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, decimated Japan's remaining carrier aviation. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carriers launched approximately 400 aircraft against American task forces. American radar detected the incoming raids at extreme range. Fighter directors guided Hellcat fighters to intercept points. The slaughter was methodical. American pilots shot down approximately 300 Japanese aircraft. Many more were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire from the screening ships. Fewer than 100 Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers. American losses were 29 aircraft. For the Japanese carrier force, this defeat was terminal. The pilots lost at the Philippine Sea could not be replaced. The training infrastructure had collapsed. Fuel shortages prevented extensive flight training. American submarine warfare had disrupted the supply of aviation gasoline from refineries in Southeast Asia. By late 1944, new Japanese carrier pilots often had less than 100 hours of flight time, compared to the 800 hours standard before the war. They could take off and land, but they lacked the combat skills to survive against experienced American pilots who might have 500 or more combat hours. The quality gap was as significant as the numerical gap. Into this context of Japanese decline and American ascendancy came the Essex-class carriers. They represented everything Japan could not match: industrial capacity, trained crews, operational efficiency, and most importantly, aircraft in overwhelming numbers. The standard Essex Air Group of 90 aircraft was theoretical. In practice, many Essex carriers operated with 100 to 110 aircraft by packing the hangar deck and parking additional aircraft on the flight deck. This was possible because of superior deck handling procedures and larger deck space. An Essex carrier could launch its entire air group in approximately 90 minutes under ideal conditions. Recovery operations were even faster, with aircraft landing at intervals of 30 to 45 seconds when necessary. Japanese carriers required significantly more time for comparable operations. Deck crews were less numerous and less experienced. Many veteran deck handlers had been killed in earlier battles. Replacement crew members lacked training. The efficiency gap meant that an American carrier could complete 2 full launch and recovery cycles in the time a Japanese carrier completed one. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders who witnessed these operations was profound. Admiral Onishi's observation in November 1944 was not unique. Multiple Japanese commanders reported similar shock at American carrier capabilities. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, wrote in his post-war interrogation that the sight of American carriers launching continuous strikes was deeply demoralizing to Japanese forces. One American carrier could put more aircraft over a target than 3 Japanese carriers, he stated. When we faced 4 or 5 American carriers simultaneously, the numerical disadvantage became hopeless. The tactical implications were devastating. Japanese commanders planning attacks against American task forces faced impossible mathematics. If a Japanese force managed to locate an American carrier group, they would face not 90 aircraft, but potentially 500 or more from multiple carriers operating together. American task groups typically consisted of 3 to 4 carriers plus escorts. Fast carrier task force formations might include 8 to 12 carriers in multiple groups spread across hundreds of square miles, but capable of coordinating their air operations. A Japanese strike force of 50 to 60 aircraft, which represented a substantial effort by late 1944 standards, would be intercepted by 200 or more American fighters before reaching the carriers. The attrition would be catastrophic. Even if some Japanese aircraft penetrated the fighter screen, they would face intense anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and screening ships. The few that survived to attack would face armored flight decks and sophisticated damage control. The likelihood of inflicting decisive damage was minimal. The likelihood of total Japanese strike force destruction was near certainty. This reality fundamentally changed Japanese naval strategy. By late 1944, conventional carrier aviation attacks against American task forces had become suicide missions, with no reasonable expectation of success. Japanese commanders stopped ordering such attacks because they achieved nothing except accelerating the depletion of already scarce pilots and aircraft. The decision to abandon conventional naval aviation tactics in favor of kamikaze attacks reflected this despair. If trained pilots in coordinated strikes could not damage American carriers, perhaps suicide attacks by minimally trained pilots in explosive-laden aircraft might succeed through sheer determination. The logic was born of desperation, not sound military strategy, yet it represented the only option Japanese commanders believed remained available. The kamikaze program, officially designated Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, or Divine Wind Special Attack Corps, was formalized in October 1944. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the same officer who had witnessed the Essex carrier launch cycle, became the primary advocate for organized suicide attacks. His reasoning was brutally pragmatic. Japan no longer possessed the trained pilots, the aircraft numbers, or the tactical advantages necessary for conventional naval aviation warfare. The mathematics that convinced Onishi were straightforward and depressing. A conventional attack required multiple aircraft to achieve a single hit on an enemy ship. Estimates varied, but intelligence suggested that perhaps 1 in 10 attacking aircraft successfully struck targets, and of those hits, perhaps 1 in 5 caused significant damage. Therefore, 50 conventional attackers might achieve 1 damaging hit. Those 50 aircraft required 50 trained pilots, extensive fuel for training and combat, coordination with other units, and fighter escorts. A kamikaze attack eliminated many variables: 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 1 bomb load aimed directly at a target. If the pilot reached the target, a hit was guaranteed. The explosive force of the aircraft's fuel, combined with the bomb load, created damage comparable to or exceeding conventional attacks. Perhaps most significantly, kamikaze attacks required minimal pilot training. A pilot needed only enough skill to take off, navigate to the target area, and crash into a ship. This could be taught in weeks rather than years. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. On October 25th, a formation of 5 Zero fighters, each loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb, attacked American escort carriers off Samar. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the attack. His aircraft struck the escort carrier USS Street Low, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay among fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting fires and explosions sank Street Low within 30 minutes. It was the first American carrier sunk by kamikaze attack. For Japanese commanders, this result seemed to validate the kamikaze concept. 1 pilot in 1 aircraft had achieved what conventional attacks increasingly failed to accomplish: the sinking of an American carrier. The fact that Street Low was a small escort carrier rather than a fleet carrier was noted, but did not diminish enthusiasm for the tactic. Over the following months, kamikaze attacks intensified. By the Battle of Okinawa in April through June 1945, Japan was launching mass kamikaze raids called kikusui, floating chrysanthemum operations. These attacks involved hundreds of aircraft, both conventional bombers and dedicated kamikaze planes, targeting the American fleet supporting the Okinawa invasion. The American response revealed both the strengths and limitations of Essex-class carriers in this new form of warfare. The carriers themselves proved remarkably resilient to kamikaze damage. Their armored flight decks, extensive compartmentalization, and sophisticated damage control systems allowed them to absorb hits that would have destroyed less robust ships. USS Franklin was struck by 2 bombs from a conventional attack, not kamikaze, on March 19, 1945, while operating off Japan. The bombs penetrated to the hangar deck where they detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch. The explosions and fires killed over 800 crew members, making Franklin the most heavily damaged carrier to survive the war. Yet Franklin did not sink. Damage control parties fought fires for hours. The carrier, though dead in the water and listing, remained afloat. She was towed to safety and eventually sailed under her own power to Brooklyn Navy Yard for repairs. The fact that Franklin survived damage that would have sunk most ships testified to the robustness of Essex-class design. USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikaze aircraft within minutes on May 11, 1945. The attacks killed nearly 400 crew members and left the carrier burning and damaged. Yet Bunker Hill also survived, was repaired, and returned to service. USS Intrepid earned the nickname Evil Eye from Japanese propaganda broadcasts because she survived multiple kamikaze hits and kept returning to combat. Hit in October 1944, she was repaired and back in action within weeks. Hit again in November, she returned again. Hit a 3rd time in April 1945 off Okinawa, she was repaired once more. The carrier seemed indestructible. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact of attacking American carriers and failing to sink them was demoralizing. Kamikaze pilots were told they would die in glorious service to the Emperor, taking an enemy carrier with them. Yet intelligence reports confirmed that most carriers hit by kamikazes remained operational. The carriers would withdraw temporarily, undergo repairs, and return to combat. The sacrifice achieved tactical damage, but rarely strategic effect. The operational tempo of American carrier operations never slackened significantly despite kamikaze attacks. This was possible because of the depth of American carrier strength. When one carrier was damaged and forced to withdraw, others immediately filled the gap. At Okinawa, the American fleet included up to 20 fleet and light carriers simultaneously. If kamikaze attacks damaged 3 or 4 carriers in a day, 15 or 16 remained operational. The air cover never disappeared. The strikes against Japanese positions never stopped. The support for ground forces continued without interruption. Japanese commanders who had hoped kamikaze attacks would force American withdrawal from Okinawa were disappointed. The Americans absorbed losses and continued operations. The ability to sustain operations despite losses reflected the ultimate expression of American industrial advantage. Essex-class carriers were not individually invincible. They could be damaged, even sunk, though none were actually lost to kamikaze attack. But they existed in such numbers that damage to individual ships did not significantly affect overall fleet capability. This redundancy was something Japan could never achieve. Every Japanese carrier lost was an irreplaceable strategic defeat. Every American carrier damaged was a temporary tactical inconvenience. By spring 1945, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. The remaining aircraft were husbanded for homeland defense. Pilot training had collapsed entirely. Fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The few remaining carriers were immobilized in port, unable to operate due to lack of fuel, lack of aircraft, and lack of trained crews. In March 1945, American carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 struck the Japanese naval base at Kure. In harbor lay the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The carriers Amagi, Katsuragi, and Ryuho sat at anchor, unable to sortie, serving as floating barracks. American pilots attacked systematically. Amagi was hit repeatedly and capsized. Katsuragi was damaged but survived. Ryuho was sunk at her moorings. The battleship carrier hybrid Issei and Hyuga were also destroyed. These ships had been converted from battleships by removing the rear turrets and adding a flight deck, a desperate attempt to create more carrier capacity. They had rarely operated aircraft and served mainly as transport ships. Now they burned in Kure Harbor, monuments to strategic failure. The contrast between these immobilized hulks and the American carrier force operating off the Japanese coast was absolute. While Japanese carriers lay helpless in port, American Essex-class carriers launched strikes deep into Japan with impunity. The Fast Carrier Task Force, designated Task Force 38 or 58, depending on which admiral commanded, operated within sight of the Japanese coast for weeks at a time. No Japanese force could challenge them. The airstrikes were relentless. American aircraft attacked airfields, destroying Japanese planes on the ground before they could be used in kamikaze attacks. They hit factories, reducing industrial production. They struck rail lines and bridges, paralyzing transportation. They bombed cities, though this mission was increasingly taken over by B-29 bombers operating from the Marianas. One little-known aspect of American carrier operations in 1945 was the efficiency with which multiple carriers coordinated their strikes. A typical large-scale raid might involve aircraft from 6 to 8 carriers, totaling 400 or more planes. These aircraft would launch from different carriers, rendezvous at predetermined points, and proceed to targets in coordinated waves. Fighter sweeps would suppress air defenses. Dive bombers would attack anti-aircraft positions. Torpedo bombers, carrying bombs rather than torpedoes for land attacks, would strike primary targets. The coordination required precise timing, sophisticated radio communication, and extensive training. American carrier groups had perfected these techniques through years of combat experience. For Japanese defenders, these raids appeared almost leisurely. American formations flew in neat patterns, untroubled by air opposition. They took time to identify targets carefully. They made repeated runs to ensure destruction. The confidence of American pilots was evident in their tactics. They operated as if Japanese airspace was their own, because effectively, it was. Japanese observers on the ground watched in helpless rage as American carrier aircraft dominated their skies. The psychological impact was profound. Japan's military had promised that the homeland would never be attacked, that Japanese forces would keep the war far from Japanese cities. Now American carrier aircraft appeared daily, flying from carriers that sailed with apparent immunity off the coast. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 came after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after Soviet entry into the war, and after months of conventional bombing and naval bombardment. But for Japanese naval officers, the surrender was merely the formal acknowledgement of a defeat they had recognized months earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been effectively destroyed by mid-1945. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. The new carriers built to replace them were sunk, damaged beyond repair, or immobilized by lack of resources. The industrial capacity to build more carriers did not exist. The trained personnel to operate them had been killed in years of attrition warfare. The fuel to power them had been cut off by American submarine warfare. Most fundamentally, the strategic concept that guided Japanese naval aviation had been proven catastrophically wrong. Quality could not overcome quantity when the gap was as vast as that between American and Japanese carrier forces. Superior training and fighting spirit, the attributes Japan had emphasized, meant nothing when facing an enemy that could replace every loss twice over, while Japan could replace nothing. The post-war interrogations of Japanese naval officers revealed the depth of their shock at American carrier capabilities. Admiral Ozawa, who had commanded carriers throughout the war, stated in his interrogation that Japanese intelligence estimates of American carrier strength were consistently wrong. Every time we received reports of American carrier numbers, we hoped they were exaggerated, Ozawa said. Every time, they were underestimated. We never grasped the true scale of American production until it was far too late to matter. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, survived the war and provided extensive testimony to American investigators. He described the psychological impact on Japanese pilots of facing endless American carriers. "We were told before the war that Americans were soft, that they could not sustain casualties, that they would negotiate peace after early defeats," Fuchida stated. "Instead, we found an enemy that absorbed losses we could never sustain and returned stronger. Their carriers seemed infinite." The technical debriefings revealed specific admiration for Essex-class carriers. Japanese naval architects studied American carrier designs after the war and marveled at the engineering solutions. The efficient arrangement of elevators and catapults, the sophisticated damage control systems, the armor protection balanced with offensive capability, all represented approaches that Japanese designers had not fully implemented. But technology was secondary to production capacity. Even if Japanese designers had created perfect carrier designs, Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure to build them in necessary numbers. The shipyards were too small, too few, too dependent on skilled craftsmen rather than assembly line workers. The raw materials were unavailable due to American submarine warfare. The workforce was mobilized for military service rather than industrial production. Every systemic advantage favored American carrier production. In the decades after the war, the Essex-class carriers became a symbol of American naval supremacy. Many remained in service for years, some into the 1990s. They were modernized repeatedly, receiving angled flight decks, steam catapults, and improved electronics. They served in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and various Cold War operations. USS Lexington, commissioned February 1943, served continuously until November 1991, nearly 50 years of service. She is now a museum ship in Corpus Christi, Texas, USA. Intrepid, the carrier that survived multiple kamikaze hits, is now a museum ship in New York City. Visitors can walk her decks and see the aircraft elevators, the catapult systems, the hangar bay, all the machinery that made these ships so formidable. The size of the ship impresses modern visitors. It's difficult to imagine that this massive vessel, over 800 feet long, was one of 17 identical sisters. USS Yorktown, commissioned April 1943, is now a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. Her displays include extensive exhibits on carrier operations during World War II. One exhibit focuses specifically on deck operations, demonstrating how carriers could launch and recover large numbers of aircraft efficiently. The choreography of deck crews moving aircraft, the precision timing of catapult launches, the split-second decisions of landing signal officers all contributed to the operational tempo that so shocked Japanese observers. For Japan, the memory of carrier warfare remains painful. The museum at Kure, the Yamato Museum, includes exhibits on Japanese carriers. Models of Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, and other carriers are displayed alongside technical specifications and battle histories. The exhibits are respectful but honest about Japan's carrier force limitations. They acknowledge that Japanese carriers were well designed but produced in insufficient numbers. They note that pilot training standards declined as the war progressed. They discuss the strategic decision to emphasize battleships over carriers in the pre-war period, a decision that proved catastrophic once war began. The contrast between Japanese and American approaches to naval aviation offers lessons that remain relevant. Industrial capacity matters. The ability to produce weapons in large numbers, replace losses, and sustain operations over years of warfare proved decisive. Technological sophistication matters less than often assumed. Japanese aircraft were often comparable or superior to American designs in the early war years, but superior technology in small numbers lost to adequate technology in vast numbers. Training and experience matter, but systems matter more. Japanese emphasis on individual pilot skill created a fragile force that collapsed once experienced pilots were killed. American emphasis on systematic training, doctrine, and coordinated operations created a resilient force that maintained effectiveness despite casualties. Strategic flexibility matters. American carriers were designed for multiple mission types, strike warfare, fleet defense, ground support, and anti-submarine operations. Japanese carriers emphasized strike warfare above all else, creating inflexibility when the strategic situation changed. Industrial mobilization matters. American willingness to employ women in shipyards, to reorganize industrial production for war, and to accept government coordination of private industry created production capacity Japan could not match. The story of Essex-class carriers and their impact on Japanese naval strategy is ultimately a story about the nature of industrial warfare. Wars between industrialized nations are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, training schools, and research laboratories. The side that can produce more weapons, train more personnel, develop better logistics, and sustain operations over years has an overwhelming advantage. Japan entered the war with qualitative advantages in pilot training, carrier operations doctrine, and aircraft performance. These advantages were real and significant in 1941 and early 1942, but they were temporary advantages that could not be sustained against an enemy with superior industrial capacity and the will to mobilize that capacity fully. By 1944, American advantages in every category, numbers of carriers, numbers of aircraft, pilot training systems, damage control, armor protection, anti-aircraft defense, coordination between ships, and industrial replacement capacity, had become so overwhelming that Japanese naval aviation could no longer compete on any level. The sight of a single Essex carrier launching 103 aircraft was merely a visible symbol of this comprehensive American superiority. Vice Admiral Onishi understood this in November 1944, when he watched that launch cycle through his binoculars. His subsequent advocacy for kamikaze attacks was not based on a belief that suicide tactics would win the war. It was based on recognition that conventional tactics had become hopeless and that desperate measures might at least impose some cost on the enemy. The desperation of that calculation reveals how completely Japanese naval strategy had collapsed. A nation that began the war with the world's most experienced carrier pilots, flying from well-designed ships, executing sophisticated operations, had been reduced within 3 years to sending minimally trained teenagers to die in suicide attacks that rarely achieved strategic objectives. The transformation from confident superiority to desperate futility was swift and total. American industrial might, embodied in the Essex-class carrier program, made that transformation inevitable. The Japanese admirals who stopped ordering conventional attacks after watching Essex carriers launch massive air groups made the only rational decision available to them. Conventional carrier aviation warfare against the United States had become militarily pointless. The gap in capability was too vast. The losses would be catastrophic and achieve nothing. The decision to stop attacking was an admission of defeat even before the war officially ended. It represented a recognition that Japan had lost the carrier war completely, irrevocably, and without possibility of reversal. The Pacific War began with Japanese carriers striking Pearl Harbor. It effectively ended with Japanese carriers, immobilized in port, while American carriers struck Japan with impunity. The symbolism was precise. Japan had gambled that a bold carrier strike could cripple American naval power and force a negotiated settlement. Instead, the attack awakened American industrial capacity. The result was a flood of carriers that Japan could neither match nor resist. Essex-class carriers represented the ultimate expression of American industrial mobilization. They were not the most technologically sophisticated ships ever built. They were not invincible. Individual carriers could be damaged, could suffer casualties, could be forced to withdraw temporarily for repairs. But they existed in such numbers that damage to individual ships meant nothing to overall fleet effectiveness. This redundancy, this depth of resources, this ability to absorb losses and continue operations without pause, was something Japan could never achieve. For Japanese admirals watching American carriers operate, the realization was crushing. They were not facing a navy. They were facing an industrial system that produced navies as a byproduct of its ordinary functioning. The Essex-class carrier program was merely one element of American military production. Simultaneously, American shipyards were producing escort carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and amphibious vessels in comparable numbers. American factories were producing aircraft by tens of thousands, tanks by tens of thousands, trucks by hundreds of thousands. American farms were feeding not only American forces but Allied forces worldwide. The scale was beyond anything Japan could comprehend from its own experience. Japan was an industrialized nation, but its industry operated on a fundamentally different scale than American industry. The gap was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. American industry was organized for mass production using interchangeable parts, assembly line techniques, and systematic management. Japanese industry retained craft production methods, skilled individual workers building products slowly and carefully. Craft production created high-quality individual items, but could not scale to meet wartime demands. Mass production created adequate quality in overwhelming quantities. In industrial warfare, overwhelming quantities of adequate equipment defeated small numbers of superior equipment. The lesson was learned at terrible cost. Over 3 million Japanese died in the war. The home islands were devastated by bombing. Cities were burned. The economy collapsed. The military was destroyed. And in the end, Japan surrendered unconditionally, occupied by the nation it had attacked at Pearl Harbor. For the carriers that Japan had built with such pride and hope, the war ended in complete annihilation. Every fleet carrier that served in the Pearl Harbor attack was sunk. Every carrier Japan built during the war was sunk or survived as a non-functional hulk. Not one Japanese carrier remained operational at the war's end. In contrast, the United States ended the war with nearly 100 carriers of all types operational, with more under construction, with trained crews available, with aircraft in storage, with the capacity to continue operations indefinitely if necessary. The disparity was so complete that it transcended normal military analysis. This was not a case of one side winning a hard-fought victory. This was systematic, total, overwhelming industrial and military dominance. Japanese admirals stopped ordering attacks because they finally understood what they faced. Not an enemy that could be defeated through courage, sacrifice, or tactical brilliance. An industrial tsunami that swept away everything before it, regardless of how bravely or skillfully Japanese forces fought. The recognition came too late to change strategy, too late to seek peace on acceptable terms, too late to preserve anything of Japan's pre-war status. By the time Japanese admirals stopped ordering attacks against American carrier groups, the war's outcome had long since been determined. The only question remaining was how much additional destruction Japan would suffer before acknowledging defeat. The answer was catastrophic. The months between late 1944, when conventional attacks against American carriers became pointless, and August 1945, when Japan surrendered, saw some of the war's most intense destruction. American carriers struck Japanese targets with increasing frequency and intensity. Japanese cities burned under incendiary attacks. The atomic bombs obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria destroyed Japan's army in China. And through it all, American carriers remained off the Japanese coast, launching strikes, demonstrating daily that Japan had lost control of its own airspace and waters. For the sailors and aviators aboard Essex-class carriers, the final months of the war had a surreal quality. Japanese resistance had not ended, but it had become disorganized and ineffective. Kamikaze attacks continued but achieved little. Anti-aircraft fire remained dangerous but was increasingly sparse. Japanese fighters rarely appeared. The Americans flew their missions with confidence, bordering on routine. This was perhaps the clearest measure of how completely the balance had shifted. Combat operations that would have been desperate struggles in 1942 had become almost routine by 1945. The photograph that perhaps best captures this dominance was taken in July 1945, shortly before Japan's surrender. It shows multiple Essex-class carriers operating together, their decks crowded with aircraft, conducting flight operations simultaneously. In the background, the Japanese coast is visible, American carriers launching strikes against Japan while sailing within sight of the enemy coast, unchallenged and secure, represented the absolute culmination of naval air power. No defending force opposed them. No submarines threatened them. No aircraft attacked them. They operated as if in peacetime, except that the aircraft they launched went to bomb Japanese targets. The contrast with Japanese carrier operations early in the war was absolute and terrible. Japanese carriers at Pearl Harbor had struck from surprise, retreating quickly to avoid counterattack. American carriers off Japan in 1945 struck repeatedly, remaining on station for days or weeks, daring the Japanese to respond. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, the formal ceremony took place on September 2nd aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But surrounding Missouri were dozens of American warships, including multiple Essex-class carriers. Their presence was symbolic. Japan was surrendering not just to the battleship Missouri, but to the carrier force that had destroyed Japanese naval aviation, to the industrial capacity that produced those carriers, to the system of military organization and logistics that sustained them, to everything they represented. For Japanese officers who attended the surrender ceremony, forced to look out at the American fleet filling Tokyo Bay, the sight must have been devastating. 4 years earlier, Japanese carriers had struck Pearl Harbor, beginning a war Japan's leaders believed they could win through superior fighting spirit and tactical skill. Now, American carriers filled Tokyo Bay, demonstrating that spirit and skill without industrial capacity were insufficient. The war had been decided not by courage, which both sides possessed, but by factories, shipyards, training systems, logistics networks, and the organized application of industrial resources to military production. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.